Okay, so we left off in last week's parsha with Rivka leaving her family's abode in the country of Aram, and she makes her way back to Israel. And what do we know about Rivka from that time? We know that Rivka appears as a person with a whole lot of energy. She has a lot of confidence, and probably she has a lot of energy and confidence that's sort of generated from her desire to do chesed. If you recall, that's how Eliezer encounters her. He asks her to, please give me some water, and we see her as just with overflowing energy and desire to provide water to Eliezer. So we see that she also has a character trait that she shares with Abraham. That is the desire and the willingness to perform acts of chesed, kindness, and charity. We also see that her parents trust her decision-making in that she is asked, do you want to go? And she says yes, and they give her the authority, the autonomy to follow through on that decision. So what happens? We find that she's a young woman. She has a lot of maturity of mind. She's strident. She's self-assured. What happens to her when she reaches Abraham's household, when she finally marries Yitzchak? So let's talk about what exactly happens to Rivka in this week's parsha. So on one level, we see that Yitzchak and Rivka are a very loving couple. Let's take a look at source number 1, because we have a very unusual turn of phrase here, a very unusual word that we do not find in many places. Vayiviyehu Yitzchak ha'ohala Sarah imo. Yitzchak brought Rivka into the tent of Sarah his mother. Vayikach Rivka, he married Rivka. Vatihila leishan, she became his wife. Vaye'ehaveha. Yitzchak acharei imo. And he loved her, and he found comfort after his mother's passing. So we see that Yitzchak finds within Rivka companionship, a relationship that allows him to get over the passing of his mother, but we also see a word here, Vaye'ehaveha, and he loved her. So we see that there is a loving relationship that exists between Yitzchak and Rivka. And we also see that there is a closeness between the two of them. Let's take a look at source number 2, because I brought here a midrash. This is from the Midrash Rabbah. What does the Midrash Rabbah say? This is source number 2. I know that not all of them are numbered in the handouts. I did correct that afterwards. If for some reason or other it didn't print with the numbers. It says, Lenochach ishto, that Yitzchak prayed opposite his wife. Melamed, this comes to teach us, Shahar Yitzchak shatuach kan v'hi shatucha kan. It means to say that they sat together in the same room together and prayed. Each one bowed down and engaged in tefillah. And this is what they said. V'omer, this is what Yitzchak said. Ribono shel olam, master of the universe. Kol barim she'ata li, any children that you give me, yihiyu min hatzadekes hazeh. Or hazo. It should come from this woman. I want all of my children that you grant me to come from this one woman. Any children that I have to receive, it should be through Rivka. Further, she said the same thing. Afhi amra kain. She also said this. Kol banim she'ata osi litein li. Any children that you are destined to give to me, yihiyu min hatzadik hazeh, should come from this tzaddik. So we see that there's a harmony between them. We see that there's a closeness, there's a wavelength, there's a relationship, a meaningful relationship. And we also see much the same when they go to Gerar. If you recall, Yitzchak, just like Abraham, was forced by a famine to leave Eretz Canaan, and he goes to the land of the Plishtim. He goes to the land of Avimelech, and there he tells everyone, just as Abraham did, this woman over here, not my wife, this is my sister. But people are able to tell, Avimelech sees by how they interact with each other, that this is actually a couple. This is actually a husband and a wife. So we're given a glimpse of Yitzchak and Rivka as having a relationship that sort of demonstrates openly a closeness, an intimacy, a togetherness. It's explicit in the verses that we just read, and it's also self-evident in their conduct, just from what we read about it. However, we also see that there are great divisions between Yitzchak and Rivka. We see that they have very different points of view, and it's most clearly expressed by source number 3. Vayehav Yitzchak as Esav kitzai b'tiv v'Rivka ohevet as Yaakov. Yitzchak favored Esav because the game was in his mouth, and Rivka favored Yaakov. So we all see that there is also a difference between them. And also in this week's Parsha, we encounter that Rivka connives to ensure that a bracha, a blessing that was meant for Esav, should actually go to Yaakov. So we also see that they're not of the same mind. So what happened here? What exactly is going on? What exactly is the relationship between Yaakov and Rivka? On one hand, we see a closeness. On the other hand, we see that there is great division between them. So in order to understand the relationship between the two, we're going to give two explanations, two ways of reading the verses and understanding what the dynamic was. And the first one is not my favorite, but this is one that we do find many references to within many sources. And this is what we're going to be focusing on at first. So let's take a step back and think of where we first encounter Rivka. What exactly is it about Rivka that we know, or what exactly can we say defines Rivka's character? Well, we know that she is an active participant, and she is very, very impressive. We have a meeting at a well where Yitzchak is not present. Eliezer, Abraham's servant, Abraham's slave, is sent out to the land of Aram to find a wife to go back to Abraham's family, to marry Yitzchak off to somebody within the mishpacha, and he meets her at the well. The well is a biblical trope, which means to say it is a scene that reappears, and it's always about betrothal. It's always about marriage. Wells and marriage seem to go together because we find at least 3 instances where wells precipitate a wedding. We have the well where Yaakov meets Rachel. We have the well where Moshe meets Tzipporah, and we have the well here where Eliezer encounters Rivka to bring her as a wife for Yitzchak.
Well, the well's a meeting place, like a coffee shop.
Yeah.
Like where everybody goes and hangs out.
But there is something notable that's different here about this well scene that's different than all the other places. So we're going to now take a look at the source on the bottom of the first page, where I'm actually reading from Rabbi Alex Israel. Rabbi Alex Israel teaches in Gush Etzion. He's a British biblical educator, and I enjoy his classes a lot. We're actually not going to agree with his point of view in this case, but let's take a look and see what he has to say. The role played here by the bridegroom and bride is a pointed divergence from the convention. Yitzchak is conspicuous by his absence from the scene. This is, in fact, the only incidence where a surrogate rather than the man himself meets the girl at the well. That substitution nicely accords with the entire career of Yitzchak. He is manifestly the most passive of the patriarchs. We have already seen him as a bound victim whose life is substituted for a ram. That's Akeda's Yitzchak. Later, as a father, he's going to prefer the son who can go out into the field and bring him back game. And his final scene that we encounter in this week's Parsha is with him lying in bed, weak and blind, while others act on him. As a complement to his absence of the bridegroom, it is only in this betrothal scene, meaning only here, as opposed to the other betrothal scenes where wells come up and precipitate a wedding, it's that it's not the suitor who draws the water, it's the girl who draws the water. The narrator goes out of his way to give weight to this act by representing Rivka as a continuous whirl of purposeful activity. In 4 short verses, she is the subject of 11 verbs of action and 1 of speech. Going down to the well, drawing water, filling the pitcher, pouring, giving to drink. One might note that the 2 verbs of rushing and hurrying, generally reserved for bringing news of the stranger's arrival, are here also repeatedly attached to Rivka's actions at the well. So here is where we find the first divergence between Yitzchak and Rivka. Yitzchak does not choose his own wife. It's chosen for him. In contrast, Rivka is very present. She's very impressive. The Torah goes at length to describe her kindness, her acts of chesed, where she provides water for this visitor, but we also see her as industrious and proactive. We also see that she's a proactive person with a lot of agency. When we read on the middle of page 2, Vayomru nikra lanara v'nishal es pia. Eliezer wants to take the girl, and the family doesn't want her to go. And so the family says, let's ask her what she wants to do. And she says, I want to go. She says, yes, I'm leaving now with Eliezer to marry Yitzchak. So she has the self-possession of a future matriarch. We see that she is very impressive. She's very proactive. She's very engaged. She has a lot of agency, while Yitzchak is exceptionally passive. And the irony here is that while Yitzchak is not actually present, he is the center of the mission. This is what everything is all about. The only motivation that Eliezer has for even being here at all is to fetch a wife for Yitzchak. So everybody's acting around him, yet Yitzchak sort of resides in the shadows. It's almost as though he's eclipsed by everyone's activity and everyone's actions. And even when we encounter Yitzchak for the first time, when Yitzchak, in the context of meeting Rivka, he's kind of just standing there. He goes out into the field, and he's doing something there. We'll talk a little bit more about that as to what he's up to. But he's very, very passive, and he's very, very stationary. He just stands. Of all the avos, of all of the patriarchs, Yitzchak is, without a doubt, the most passive. And it would seem from the Akedah onwards, he almost adopts like a victim-type mode of behavior where everything happens to him and he's always the subject of other people's arrangements. Also, let's talk then about the following incident. So, Yitzchak and Rivka, they consummate their marriage, and Rivka is pregnant. She's pregnant, the babies are fighting in the womb, and so what does she do? She says, what's going on here? So according to some commentators, she prays. According to other commentators, she went to see a prophet. Again, the same thing comes up. Why is it that she's the one who's praying? Why isn't Yitzchak praying? Why is it that she's the one who goes to seek the prophet? Why couldn't Yitzchak have been the prophet for her? Couldn't he have served as a communicator? Doesn't he have nevuah? Doesn't he have prophecy? Couldn't Hashem have addressed this to him and he could share it with her? Also, within the blessing story, Yitzchak is blind, he's inactive, he's being acted upon, while Rivka is, again, very active, and she's orchestrating the events as they sort of manifest, and she's doing this all behind the scenes. She ensures that the scheme that she plans come to fruition all over and above Yitzchak's head. So, right away, we see that there is this incredible difference in their roles. But what I'm going to perhaps show you is that is only part of the story. When Eliezer brings Rivka back, we find that he's sitting in the field, right? He goes out into the field and he's lasuach basoda, which means he's praying or he's meditating. Let's take a look at Rivka's reaction to this encounter. So this is also on the second to last paragraph on page number 2. It's source number 6 on the Hebrew side. It says it's in Genesis, page 24. Raising her eyes, Rivka saw Yitzchak, and she alighted from the camel. In the Hebrew, it's a little bit more ambiguous. It could also mean that she fell off of the camel. Who is this man walking in the field towards us? She asked the servant. And so the servant says, that's my master. So she took her veil and covered herself. So Rivka's falling and then covering her mouth before she even knows the identity of this stranger puzzles the commentators. And they ask, what exactly is going on over here? So Rashi explains, and that's the first source that you have, the bottom source that you have here. It says, Ro'asa oso, she saw him. What did she see? Ro'asa oso hazor v'soha mipanov. She saw his glory, and she was astounded. She was impressed by his dignified carriage. He was something impressive about him. That's how Rashi explains it. But others see this much, much differently. And we're going to now turn to page number 3 to read from the Nitziv. The Nitziv is Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Berlin. and he was a rabbi in 19th century Russia. And this is what he wrote. First he quotes Rashi, what we just read, and then he says, Rivka looked upon Yitzchak while he was in prayer. He looked like an angel of God, fearful in appearance, and she fell off the camel, from fright. She did not know who he was, and she covered her face with a veil from fear and embarrassment, because now she just learned that this is to be her husband, as if with the realization that she was not worthy to be his wife. From that moment on, there was always a sense of trepidation in her heart. Her relationship with Yitzchak was very different from Sarah and Avraham's or Rachel and Yaakov's. With them, if there was ever a problem, they would not be afraid or apprehensive about talking it through with their spouses. But that wasn't so with Rivka. This story is the prologue to the entire story of this week's Parsha of Toldot, where Yitzchak and Rivka have very different opinions. Rivka can never bring herself to talk to Yitzchak about the truth she felt regarding Esav, and the same is true about the bestowing of the blessings. So the Netziv here is pinpointing two things. First of all, hey Ephraim. First of all, is that Yitzchak went up onto the altar and never came down. He was always that Ola Tamima. He was always that pure and sacred sacrifice. He had this pure spiritual energy, almost like that of an angel. And seeing Yitzchak in prayer was terrifying. And we could even suggest that this was a reality that followed Yitzchak and his relationship with Rivka throughout the entirety of their lives. Because the second point is that Rivka, who was, until this point, very self-assured, she had a lot of self-confidence, loses it all when she first encounters Yitzchak. She falls off the camel at their initial meeting. The Torah barely records them communicating with each other. The very first time we see her ever say anything to him is when she says, okay, it's time for us to send Yitzchak away to my brother Lavan to find a spouse. I don't want him to marry one of the local Hittites. But we see that in a family in need of a lot of communication, silence reigns. Rivka was terrified of Yitzchak. She was petrified. She felt alienated. She felt that there was something spiritual, something sublime, something so great, and she doubted, could or should I be married to this individual? And that's how the Netziv understands their relationship. And this becomes the source of many, many problems. The problem with the brachas, for example, is because she couldn't talk to him. The prophecy was because she just couldn't bring herself to communicating with him. Now, this is a very unconventional and tragic reading of the story, but again, it perhaps has a basis. We see that the Netziv says this, and it also is echoed by the Ramban, Nachmanides, who also suggests that Rivka never told Yitzchak about the prophecy of her children, where the young would rule or dominate the older. She was simply too scared to tell him, at least according to this understanding, this reading. And it also helps us understand why Rivka felt compelled to subvert Yitzchak's plan, because she needed the blessing to be bestowed upon Yaakov according to her prophecy. One of the people who came around to my shul in London, every so often we had guest speakers, was a woman by the name of Aviva Zornberg, and she teaches in the seminaries in Israel, and she, very interesting lady, she does a lot, she's very, very learned, and she in anticipation of her visit, she published a little bit of an essay, in our shul publication, and I've reproduced some of it for you here. We're actually going to read it over here, and this is the second half of page number 3. Rivka, whose loving alacrity and energy are reminiscent of Abraham's, meets Yitzchak in the field, and her whole body falls. She veils herself before the otherworldliness of a Yitzchak wrapped in prayer. The girl who unhesitatingly, in response to her family's question, expressing their doubt, will you go with this man, becomes the woman who questions time and time again the value of her life. We see this frequently. Her visceral reaction to her daughters-in-law, Esav's wives, was, I'm disgusted with my life. If Yaakov marries a Hittite woman, what good will life be to me? This why life question strikes a new note in the biblical register. She is the philosopher who interrogates life harshly and skeptically. She puts life to the question. Most striking in this vein, however, is her enigmatic cry as the infants struggle in the womb. If so, why do I exist? Again, we have this very tragic picture, and it's possibly even disturbing, which is why I'm going to give a different interpretation. But essentially, what we're positing is that Yitzchak and Yitzchak and Rivka had a silent marriage filled with fear, distance, and misunderstanding. And this precipitated all the problems and was born by the virtue of the fact that Rivka always questioned, am I worthy to remain married to this spiritual, holy, sublime whirlwind that is Yitzchak? She encountered him in prayer, according to Nitziv, and this utterly petrified her, and this set the stage for a course or a series of causes and effects that are tragic. However, as I started the class, I don't think that this reading is correct, because we find that there is a closeness between them. For example, we have that very first pasuk. If you wanted to take a look again, it says over here that he loved her. They had a love and caring relationship. In the Midrash that we read a moment ago, they would pray together. They would act in concert. We also see that they are of the same mind and share the same sentiment when it came to sending Yaakov back to marry into Lavan's household. We see that they do agree. We see that they do communicate. We see that they do talk. So we're going to present a different explanation, a different interpretation, and then follow that with and read that into the narrative. We're going to take a look at Rav Steinsaltz. He sees that Rivka and Yitzchak's differences don't cause a rift and a lack of communication. Rather, they're differences that we do note, where one is very proactive and the other one is very passive, is actually facilitates a loving relationship where each partner feels that the other completes them and even becomes the glue that holds them together. According to Rav Steinsaltz, their relationship was, while they were different people, their differences don't create a rift, their differences create a bonding. Perfect. Very good. Thank you. Let's take a look at what Rav Steinsaltz writes. We're not going to read the whole thing. Rebecca is the opposite of Yitzchak and complementary to him. Yitzchak appears outstandingly as a person who does not make decisions. At every stage of his life, it was Rivka who decided and acted accordingly and with confidence, whereas Yitzchak was hesitant and unsure. Why is this? Rivka was the opposite of Yitzchak. Why? Yitzchak grew up surrounded by trustworthy people. He had an aristocratic mother and a father of the noblest character. Yitzchak's world was supportive. It was secure. He could hesitate and could even afford to make mistakes. This is because there were always others around who loved him and were concerned for him, who could always back him up, who could support him. Yitzchak did not know of a world of evil and deceit. Rivka, on the other hand, grew up in the house of Lavan, whose failings she knew too well. She had learnt the meaning of cheating, of hypocrisy. And this knowledge lay at the root of the difference between Rivka and Yitzchak and their relationships with their children. Thus, the relationship between Rivka and Yitzchak acquired additional significance. For her, he represented another world, a higher level of being. She was bound to him and perhaps loved him because of his purity. So according to Rav Steinsaltz, they were aware of each other's strengths, they were aware of each other's failures, and the love of each other was a product of their differences. And we might even be able to say that opposites attracted in this case. Their differences was the recipe for a loving, bonding, meaningful relationship. So let's go back to that initial meeting between Rivka and Yitzchak. We find that there is a parity in the language. Yitzchak looked up and saw people from afar. Rivka looked up and saw a man standing in the field. We might say that this describes the very first time that they saw each other. She looked up and he looked up. Their eyes met, and it was love at first sight. Rivka encountered something that she had never seen before. Who did she grow up with? Besuel and Lavan. She grew up in a house of idolatry, of paganism. Finally, she sees a man in the field praying, and she has now found someone who operates on the same wavelength as her, and she had a sense of longing, a sense of connection now. She was meeting an individual who now shared the same religious concerns that she herself carried. Her own inclinations were now shared with another one for the very first time. And she saw a man in prayer and was moved. This was love at first sight. And perhaps also we can reinterpret the whole well-seen trope. Alex Israel, as we mentioned earlier, describes the well as a scene where a suitor meets a prospective bride. And we said that Yitzchak wasn't there, it was Eliezer acting on his behalf. Right? That's what we said is the trope. Maybe that wasn't the real well meeting. Where did this all take place? Where did Rivka and Yitzchak, where did they meet? Does anybody remember the place name?
In a field?
It was in a field next to Be'er Lachai Ro'i, the well of Lachai Ro'i. This is the well scene. The other one was just a prelude, but it wasn't the real well scene. This is the real one. And Yitzchak here is an active participant. He's, yes, not doing all that much. He's standing. He is a rather passive member of the patriarchal line, but she's now meeting him for the first time, and he's impressing her, just like Moshe impressed Tzipporah by chasing away all the people who were stopping her from watering her fields. And just as Yaakov impressed Rachel by being able to push off the stone. How did Yitzchak impress Rivka? Through his zeal, through his purity, and the act of prayer. So this is the trope with a new dimension, where the young woman is now being impressed, not by acts of bravery or by acts of strength, but by acts of piety. And the scene actually does end with the consummation of their marriage. And this is perhaps the way that we can read and understand how Yitzchak and Rivka, despite being so different, were able to find a life together and a meaningful way to connect. And the well scene that precipitates this wedding is the same well scene that we're all familiar with. It's just not the one that we anticipated. So now let's go back to this week's Parsha, where we talk about the brachos, the blessings, and this is where we'll conclude. Rivka orchestrates Yaakov's masquerade. Where his father, Yaakov's father, Yitzchak, is tricked. What was she thinking? Why did she trick Yitzchak? Why couldn't she have spoken to Yitzchak? So we're going to talk three answers. The first of which is, as we started off with, which is what the Ramban says, is that what was she doing? Why did she need to make the blessings manifest in Yaakov and not Esav? Well, it's because she was acting on the basis of her prophecy, the nevuah that she received. She had never communicated the content of this nevuah to Yitzchak, but she knew that the older is meant to serve the younger. And so now she has to act to rectify this prophecy to ensure that it will become true. Because of her nevuah, she was compelled to ensure that Yaakov received the bracha. And this is predicated on the first explanation that we gave, that Yitzchak and Rivka did not communicate. Another way we can perhaps explain it is that she thought Yitzchak was mistaken in his plan of choosing Esav. and she couldn't tell him because she was too intimidated by her husband. So she found a subversive way of pushing it through. So either A, it's because of the prophecy, or B, she felt that her husband made a mistake, but the communication still wasn't there. Now, these stories obviously have the problem. The problem again is, why didn't they speak? And if we're going to rely on the first explanation, frankly, I don't like that explanation all that much. I do not want to think of the avos and the imos as living in an unhappy or silent, stressful relationship. So obviously, we're going to work with a different interpretation that works better with Rav Steinsaltz's understanding of their relationship. And this comes to us from Rav Shamshin Raphael Hirsch, and this is what he writes. Yitzchak believed that the Avrahamic calling was to be carried out by Esav and Yaakov in brotherly union. He therefore intended on giving Esav a blessing with content of a material nature and giving Yaakov a blessing of a spiritual one. They were meant to join and create a Jewish people in unison. Rav Hirsch explains that where Yitzchak wanted to divide the family leadership between an active go-getter son and a philosopher, religious, theologian son, Rivka disagreed. Rivka claimed that Esav had no sensitivity to spiritual values and wouldn't make any room for Yaakov's value system. Yitzchak insisted that Rivka misjudged Esav, while Rivka understood, because of her interactions with her brother and her father, what it means to be the kind of person that Esav was. It will not work. But in any event, according to Rav Hirsch, this was a fight that they had been arguing about for years, which means they had been communicating. They were different. Yes, they had different modes of behavior, different ways of behaving, different ways of interfacing, a different perspective of the universe, of the world. But they had a loving relationship, a close relationship, a relationship that was bonded in the opposite attracts phenomenon. And they communicated, they spoke, and here they disagreed. So again, we started off with various ways of reading verses. We spoke about how sometimes it seems to indicate that they had a lot of love and a lot of connection, and they were a very, it was a beautiful relationship. On the other hand, we see that they were quite different and they had divergent personalities. We saw the Netziv who says that Rivka was terrified of her husband because of his spiritual intensity. We saw Rav Steinsaltz's explanation that it was an opposites attract type dynamic, but they did have a loving, meaningful, and communicative relationship. They did talk, and here, according to Rav Hirsch, as a result of ongoing discussions, ongoing arguments, ongoing interactions with each other, it ultimately brought Rivka to feel compelled to trick her husband. But this was not an action that was born of a lack of communication. This actually came with abundant amounts of interaction, discussion, and disagreement. So, at any rate, I hope this sheds some light on the personality of Rivka and perhaps sort of explains the Rivka-Yitzchak dynamic in a new way. And there's definitely a lot to speculate on because there's a lot of evidence that goes either way. And so we'll have to spend some time independently studying, and maybe if you have a better or a different way of interpreting all these events, I'm all ears, and I'm happy to hear from you. But this concludes my class.
Thank you.